a single stretch of West 57th Street in Manhattan, home to some of the tallest, thinnest, most expensive residential towers ever built. Central Park Tower, 157.432 Park Avenue, 220 Central Park South. Units here have sold for over $100 million. And yet, on any given night, walk past these buildings and look up. Half the lights are off. Not because it's late, because nobody's home. This isn't a ghost story. It's a business model, and it's failing in ways that are now impossible to ignore. Let's break down exactly why. Reason 1. These buildings were never designed to be lived in. Billionaire's Row emerged in the 2010s as developers realized something. They didn't need to sell homes to people who wanted to live in New York. They needed to sell assets to people who wanted to park money somewhere safe. A $60 million condo isn't a home in this model. It's a savings account with a view. Developers built accordingly. Units were marketed heavily overseas, to buyers in Russia, China, the Middle East, and Latin America, often through shell companies and LLCs, specifically structured to obscure ownership. A 2019 New York Times investigation into one building alone found the majority of units were owned through anonymous LLCs, not named individuals. When the buyer's entire goal is asset storage rather than residency, occupancy was never the point. Emptiness isn't a side effect of this business model. It's the business model. Reason 2. The math only works if nobody actually lives there. Here's the part that sounds backwards until you follow the numbers. A fully owned, empty luxury unit is often more valuable and less risky to its owner than a rented one. Rental income in a market like this is negligible compared to the unit's price tag, but renting introduces real risk, tenant disputes, wear and tear, and in New York specifically, tenant protection laws that make it harder to remove a renter than most international buyers are willing to deal with. So the calculation becomes simple. Why rent out a $40 million asset for a return that barely moves the needle, when leaving it empty costs you almost nothing beyond property tax and maintenance, both of which are treated as a rounding error by buyers at this wealth level? The unit isn't sitting empty because no one wants it. It's sitting empty because, for its owner, occupancy was never worth the risk. Reason 3. The tax structure made emptiness profitable. For years, New York's property tax assessment system significantly undervalued ultra-luxury condos relative to their actual sale price, largely because the assessment formulas were built around older co-op and rental buildings, not $100 million super-tall towers. This meant owners of some of the most expensive units in the country were paying property taxes that, as a percentage of the unit's value, were dramatically lower than what a middle-class homeowner pays in most American cities. Combine that with the fact that many of these buyers weren't seeking any income from the property at all, and you get a structure where the annual cost of owning an empty, multi-million-dollar apartment was, for this buyer pool, essentially negligible. The building didn't need to generate value through use. It just needed to sit there, quietly appreciating, costing almost nothing to hold. Reason 4. The 2019 mansion tax and pied-à-terre backlash. New York eventually caught up. In 2019, the state passed an expanded mansion tax, adding a steep, tiered additional tax on residential sales over $2 million, hitting hardest at the very top of the market these towers were built for. A proposed pied-à-terre tax, targeting owners of second homes worth over $5 million who don't claim New York as their primary residence, generated massive political pressure, specifically because so many Billionaire's Row units were exactly that. The pied-à-terre tax itself was ultimately not implemented in the form originally proposed, but the political fight around it did something arguably more damaging to developers. It made the entire model publicly toxic. What had been a quiet, under-the-radar strategy for the ultra-wealthy became front-page material about empty towers looming over a city with a serious affordable housing shortage. Sales slowed. Some units originally listed at record prices sat on the market for years, with several towers still reporting a majority of units unsold or unoccupied years after completion. Reason 5. Overbuilding created a supply nobody actually needed. Between roughly 2014 and 2019, developers raced to complete an unprecedented cluster of ultra-luxury super-tall towers within blocks of each other. essentially flooding an extremely narrow market with nearly identical inventory at the exact same time. There simply were not enough buyers in the specific $100 million and up bracket to absorb that much simultaneous supply, regardless of how desirable any individual building was. This created a standoff. Developers who had already sunk billions into construction couldn't meaningfully drop prices without spooking existing buyers who'd paid full price and expected their asset to appreciate, not depreciate. So instead of lowering prices to sell faster, many towers simply let units sit unsold for years, listed at their original valuations, waiting for a buyer pool that, at that price point and that volume, may never fully materialize. Reason 6. COVID exposed the model's fragility. The pandemic didn't create this problem, but it exposed exactly how hollow the occupancy model already was. With international travel restricted for extended periods, the already thin pool of overseas buyers who might occasionally use these units simply stopped coming altogether. Buildings that were already reporting low occupancy saw that number drop even further, with some towers reportedly having only a small fraction of units occupied on any given night, even years after completion. At the same time, COVID accelerated a broader shift among some wealthy buyers towards suburban and second home purchases outside dense urban cores, redirecting exactly the kind of capital that had been fueling Billionaire's row toward other asset classes entirely. The towers didn't just stay empty. They became a symbol of exactly the kind of speculative, disconnected real estate development that critics had been warning about since construction began. Putting it together. So when you look up at Billionaire's row and see darkened windows across half a building that cost over $1 billion to construct, you're not looking at bad luck. You're looking at the predictable outcome of a business model built entirely around asset storage instead of housing. Buildings marketed globally to buyers who wanted safety, not shelter. Financial structures that made emptiness cheaper than renting. A tax system that rewarded holding property without living in it. A political backlash that made the entire strategy publicly toxic, right as the buildings were finishing. An oversupply of nearly identical ultra-luxury inventory competing for the same tiny buyer pool. And a pandemic that stripped away what little occupancy incentive remained. These towers weren't poorly designed as buildings. Structurally, technically, they're some of the most advanced residential engineering in the world. They failed as a business model, because the entire plan depended on treating homes as financial instruments in a city that, eventually, pushed back. Billionaire's row isn't empty because no one can afford it. It's empty because, for the people who bought there, living in it was never really the point. Subscribe to Faulty Blueprint, because every failure has a design, and we're just getting started.